All of us, without exception, have known what it means to be disappointed. Maybe a job that we didn't get, a holiday we went on that turned out to be awful, maybe an item that we bought and it really wasn't what we thought it was going to be, maybe a person who has really disappointed us. And we know what it is to have a heavy heart, don't we? Well, the disciples of Jesus Christ were utterly and completely dejected. Their hopes had been dashed, because whilst there were many others who were glad that Jesus Christ was gone, that was the end of him, this particular group of people were absolutely devastated, because they believed that he was the Son of God. They'd followed him for 3 years. They were devoted to him. They were convinced that he was the Messiah. And suddenly, and unexpectedly as far as they were concerned, it was all over. And on that Saturday, they must have been at their very lowest. We know they were hiding away in case they would be found and they would be next. Jesus Christ, as far as they were concerned, lay in the stillness and coldness of the tomb. And it's hard to imagine a more disillusioned, disappointed, dejected group of people than those disciples. But the next event changed everything. Their lives were never the same again, and what they experienced affected them profoundly, and of course has affected the whole world. These disciples and these women were transformed from disillusioned, broken people to those who were full of joy and courage and excitement and confidence. And it was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as we were saying to the children, that changed those people. Nothing else could have done it. They were new people because they had seen Jesus Christ alive. And they took that message to the whole world. I want just to look very briefly at the story that we read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 16. If you want to follow along, that's what we're going to look at just for a few moments together. These women going to the tomb on that first Easter Sunday morning. And I just want to highlight 3 things for you as we look at these verses. In the first place, we discover that there is a great obstacle. There's a great obstacle. Now, the drama starts on Sunday morning. The woman would have gone after 6 o'clock on the Saturday evening. Remember, that was their Sabbath. They would have gone after 6 o'clock. That was when the Sabbath finished, as far as the Jews were concerned. They would have bought spices. They couldn't save Jesus Christ, but here's one thing that they could do for him. Now, we know that they were present when Jesus died. And chapter 15 and verse 40 says that they were there and they saw where Jesus was laid. They watched as his life ended. They watched as Joseph took his body and buried that body. And verse 47 tells us that they marked the place where he lay. So it's no surprise to us then, really, I suppose, in one sense, that on the Sunday morning, these women who were devoted to Jesus Christ would make their way to his tomb. And they went with heavy hearts. They probably thought about the events of the previous 24, 36 hours. And we're told that they were discussing together a problem that faced them. Because we read in verse 3, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? So that was their concern. They wondered how they would get into the tomb to anoint Jesus' body with spices, which hadn't been done when he died. It was normally done in those days. They hadn't been able to do it because it all happened so quickly. They wanted to do it now, realized there was a stone across, and they were concerned that it would be a hindrance to them. They knew that they themselves would be unable to move the stone, and they worried about how they were going to overcome it. They were perplexed. There was an obstacle that stood in their way. Now, maybe you are feeling like that today as you come to church. Maybe there's something in your mind or in your heart that looms very, very large. And you come here perplexed. Maybe it's a decision that you have to make. Maybe it's a task that you have to face. Maybe it's about somebody that you love, for whom you have great concern. Maybe it's a particular problem that simply will not go away. These women could not have removed this stone. It was impossible. But what we discover is that in the end, the power of God intervened to deal with the obstacle that they face. Now, you and I can often be tempted in life to think about the obstacles that lie ahead or may lie ahead, and we worry ourselves sick about them, things that might happen. And we know that worry and anxiety achieves absolutely nothing, and yet we still do it. If these women had known what they were about to see, if they realized what God was doing, they wouldn't have fretted and been anxious and worried about the stone, because in the end it was not going to be an obstacle for them. Now you see, you and I, through Jesus Christ, are able to trust in the God who removed the stone from these women, who brought Christ from the grave. And if we trust in him, then is it not also true that we ought not to be overwhelmed by those things that come into our lives? Because if God wishes, he can deal with them as he pleases. Now, of course, there's no guarantee for us that God will remove the troubles from us and the obstacles that lie before us. He can, but if he doesn't, we trust him to give us the grace to help us to deal with whatever it is that lies before us. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. And you would really love to come to Jesus Christ, but there's a great obstacle before you, something that troubles you and that keeps you back from him. Maybe it's a habit that you have. Maybe it's something that you would have to admit. Maybe it's somebody that you would have to face. Or maybe you're concerned about the new lifestyle or how you would keep it up. Well, remember this. The God who raised Jesus Christ from the dead will be at work in you. He will give you new life. He will give you the power to change and the strength to face those issues that come to you. If Jesus Christ was able to change a crooked Zacchaeus, an immoral Samaritan woman, a church hater Paul, then he can do it also for you. So let's trust God for those obstacles that lie before us, the things that keep us back, that we're anxious about, that we can often do nothing about. Let's trust him to be at work in us, in our situations, and to help us to do what pleases him. There was a great obstacle. But we also notice in these verses that there's a great uncertainty. Because the Bible tells us what's in the minds of these women, but it also tells us what's in their hands, and that's important too. Because as I mentioned, these women are carrying spices to anoint the body of Jesus. They'd gone and bought them specifically. And they wanted to come now and anoint him as they'd been unable to before. And they expected to find him dead in the tomb where he had been placed on Saturday. So you see, the spices in their hands were really a sign of their unbelief. But they were in good company, weren't they? Because we read that the woman went and told the others, but they did not believe. We find that in verse 11. Verse 13 tells us the same. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. The very people who really should have believed, the disciples, the 12 who've been with him, the 11 now who've been with him for all those years, but they didn't. Christ told them that he would die and rise again. The messenger said to the woman, "Go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And Jesus, on a number of occasions, had told the disciples that he was going to suffer and he was going to die, but he was going to rise again from the dead. And they simply didn't believe it. They didn't expect it would happen, and when it did, they refused to believe. And we're told in verse 14 that Jesus rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. So here are the people who are at the very center of this drama. And they don't believe that Jesus Christ is raised from the dead. Maybe you're here today and you're like these women. Maybe in your mind and your heart are the marks of uncertainty. There is doubt that lingers within you. Remember this: doubt and uncertainty does not disqualify anybody from the kingdom of God, because it didn't disqualify these women. And down the centuries, there have been many people who have doubted the things that the Bible tells us. If these women, who were the closest to Jesus Christ, who knew him best, if they doubted, it should not surprise us if doubt creeps into our minds at times. And the reason that these women came with unbelief is because of what had happened previously. They'd witnessed it all. They'd seen his life come to a sad ending, and that made a lasting impression on them. And they simply couldn't believe that anything other than death would be his experience. And maybe you can identify with them in a different way. Maybe something has happened to you. Maybe you've been desperately disappointed in life. Maybe someone has really let you down badly. Perhaps you feel life has been unfair. Maybe you've experienced financial difficulties. Maybe you feel betrayed by somebody that you trusted. Your hopes have been dashed. Something that you really wanted, you never received. And your soul is downcast and disillusioned. And you wonder if all this stuff is really true. And in your mind you say to yourself, I wonder if the Easter story actually happened. But maybe you're filled with doubts for another reason. Maybe somebody that you know at work or in school, or somebody in your family, or somebody that lives near you, and they have been telling you this is all a load of nonsense. And Satan has been using those words, and he's been whispering into your soul that you are a fool to believe these things. You are fooling yourself. And you've been listening to those words. And you sit this morning in uncertainty and doubt. Well, let me simply stress this. Regardless of what these women believed or didn't believe, the fact was this: the tomb was empty and Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. And that was true no matter what they came to do, or whether the other disciples would believe it or not. That was true. You see, this story that we have of the resurrection, it oozes reality. The very fact, you see, that these women featured in this story is something that is only there because it was true. Because in these particular days, women, as you probably know, were kept very much down. They were in the background. They were not allowed to testify in court. If someone had been writing a story, if they had put it together just so that they could convince people that it was true, even though it wasn't, these women would not have been included. Do you think if someone had been fabricating this message, they would have told about Judas, who betrayed Jesus, one of the 12? Would they have told about Peter, who denied him, the one who said he loved him most, and yet ended up saying he didn't even know him? Do you think it would have included that all the disciples ran away for fear of their lives and he died on the cross alone? If you'd been putting together a story that would be believable, you wouldn't have included any of those things. But the reason they're all in there is because they actually happened. And those who wrote the story wrote it as it was. And as those things truly unfolded, they're all here because it's true. This message has changed the lives of millions on this planet over the centuries, hasn't it? If this was not true, this message would never have got beyond Jerusalem. It would have been silenced in days. It would have been shown to be utterly false, and it would never have been heard of again. Friends, here's the important thing. Regardless of our doubts and our uncertainties, and we all have them, life can bring those to us. Regardless of them, this story is true. Despite our disappointments, despite the wounds that are sometimes inflicted on us and the doubts and uncertainties that we have. And if this is true, then nothing is more important. And we hold on to it. And the doubts will come and go, but this will remain forever. Great uncertainty. And lastly, great message. Great message. Notice the last thing the angel says to the woman is, "Go and tell his disciples and Peter." Now, isn't that strange? It says, "Tell him he is risen." The most glorious sentence, perhaps, in the whole of the Bible. Here's a man who claimed equality with God. He said that he'd come to give his life as a ransom for many. He said he was the Messiah. He was the way, the truth, and the life. He said, "I am the resurrection and the life. I am the door. Come to me that you might have life. If you believe in me, you will never die." Well, if Jesus Christ was dead and finished, what about those words? But of course, he's alive. He's defeated death. He's overcome the grave. He's conquered our greatest enemy. He's the Lord of life, and his words can be trusted. We can believe all that he said about life and death and heaven and hell. We can hold his promises to our hearts. Let me go back to Peter. Why did they say, "Tell the disciples and Peter"? Well, you probably know why. Of course, he was one of the disciples. In fact, we might say he was the number one disciple. What the angel is saying is, tell the disciples, make sure you tell Peter as well, especially Peter. Let him know that Jesus Christ wants to meet him, that he is included. Now, the angel said that because of what Peter had done. For those years of Jesus' ministry, Peter was the most prominent and forceful of the disciples. Remember, he said he would rather die for Jesus than run away. In the garden, do you remember he used the sword to attack the servant of the high priest? And looking at the disciples up until the crucifixion, you would say, well, if anybody's going to be faithful to Jesus, it will be Peter. But in the end, he was the most disloyal of all. He refused to acknowledge Jesus Christ. The one who said he would give the greatest demonstration of his love actually made the foulest curse. The Bible tells us that Christ looked at at Peter, and it was like a knife to his soul, and he wept bitterly. He hated himself. That's why the angel said, tell Peter, because he's full of self-loathing and remorse. And the message is, tell Peter that despite what he's done, he's not rejected. Christ will meet him. There's still a place for him. Now, friends, maybe that's a message for you today. Maybe at this Easter time there's something in your mind, in your past, and you're ashamed of it. Something maybe you did once, or maybe you did a number of times, or maybe it was long ago, or maybe something that you've been involved in recently. Maybe it's a pattern that's developed in your life and you feel that it really is a denial of Jesus Christ. Maybe it's the way that you've treated somebody else. Maybe you've deceived others. Maybe your heart's becoming cold. You're drifting away. Maybe there was a day that you walked close with Jesus Christ and today you're following far off. Oh, you still attend maybe? But it's more of a ritual. Well, here's a word for you. Tell the disciples, and you put your own name in there. Whatever your name is, tell the disciples and you. Friends, remember the events of this weekend were so that people like you could be forgiven. Not one sin, not once, but many times. The purpose of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ was so that you could be restored, so that you could come back to him and confess your sin and be cleansed and begin again if you need to. You know, the wonderful thing about Peter is this. He was used much more after his denial than he was before. And it all started on this first Easter Sunday. Friends, let's remember, I've said it before, failure is not final. Cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is precisely because we are failures. And if we love him, then he will not give up on us, but he will continue to love us and keep us. The Bible says that God invites us, return to me, and I will return to you. And we can still serve God, and we can still be used by him, and we can make our lives count for the one who died and rose again so that we might live. Let's pray.